Good evening. Good evening. Number 937. 937. After this song, Dr. Jeff Miller will be speaking to us again this evening. He is back and will be continuing his creation seminar that he has been doing for the past several weeks. So 937, he'll come speak to us, and then we'll have our closing prayer and be dismissed this evening. Number 937. You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depth of your love? You are beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above. And I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due. I stand in awe of you.
All right, glad to be back. It's been a couple weeks. Was out of town all last week. Before I forget, Brother Elliott brought some items up here that he said are available for anybody that wants to check those out. Some fossils and that sort of thing. All right, so we have been looking at building the creation model from a scientific perspective from the ground up. And so we started out answering the question, can you even know from physical evidence and through reasoning, so logical, philosophical evidence, that there is a God? And then we looked at, well, how can you know which God it is that exists? And then we looked at, okay, let's say it is the God of the Bible. Was the Bible actually authored by God, or was it just humans that wrote that? And then we looked at, well, what does the Bible actually teach about what has happened in history, whatever kind of events might have occurred that would affect how we understand the scientific world around us, which, of course, the two big events being creation and the flood. If those two things happen, then that is going to affect our understanding and interpretation of all the evidence in science across the board. It's a totally different foundation than evolution and the Big Bang and naturalism, which are the standard, of course, dogma in science today. But if you start with the assumption that creation and the flood are true, you're going to totally interpret the same evidence in a different way. And so we looked at what the Bible teaches on that subject, and then a lot of the science that supports that. And then we answered the question, can you know that the creation model is a valid model? Is it backed by scientific evidence, and can it make predictions that can then be verified when you go and look at the evidence, which is what we looked at last time. In this session, I want to answer the question, is the creation model what we call robust? Is it scientifically defensible against attacks? And I want to answer that question by looking at some of the arguments that Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, as I like to call him, some of the arguments he made in his debate with Ken Ham back in, I guess it was 2014. And there are some copies of this. These are free on the free table back in the back, where I go into this material much more in depth and look at other things that were dealt with in that debate that we won't have time to look at tonight. So I'm curious, raise your hand if you saw this debate back in 2014. Anybody see the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate? Okay, a couple of you. This was seen by millions and millions of people across the country, and so not surprisingly, some of the arguments that were made by Bill Nye are used by others. because the debate went real well for Ken Ham, who's the CEO at Answers in Genesis. This is where the Ark encounter is, the full-sized Ark replica is and all. And so he's the one that was debating Bill Nye, and Ken Ham did a good job the first half of the debate. Second half of the debate, that didn't go as well because there were a lot of points that Bill Nye brought up that Ken Ham did not really deal with. And it could leave the impression that we don't have an answer to those things because he didn't actually deal with those in the debate. So I want to go ahead and look at some of those points that were made in that debate that he did not deal with. So, for example, he said, this is Bill Nye, he said, how can you have hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering in the ice cores if the Earth is actually only a few thousand years old? How can you have trees that can be dated as being older than the flood and even creation in some cases, if in fact the Earth is only a few thousand years old, as the Bible suggests? How can you have civilizations with histories that go back beyond the flood? If all civilizations were wiped out in the flood, then you shouldn't have civilizations that can then go back further in time than that. And if all the animals are wiped out, all the land animals in the flood, then how do you get animals from the ark over to Australia after the flood? He said if you've got something like, say, 7,000 species of creatures on the ark, how do you get from that to the some 16 million species you have on the planet today? That would be the equivalent of 11 new species emerging every day over the last 4,000 years. He said there isn't even enough space on the ark for even those 7,000 ark species. So the ark just wouldn't be big enough. And he said also a wooden vessel of the size of the ark just could not possibly be seaworthy. And he cited the Wyoming as an example of a large wooden vessel that was so big that it was just not seaworthy. It ultimately had leakage and sank due to how big this vessel was. So let's go ahead and respond to these 7 points. And again, I deal with those in this article in a more in-depth way if you want to dig into that. So as the first point I want to look at is this first one, the idea that there are hundreds of thousands of years documented in the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica. And so first of all, we need to understand what are ice cores. This is where scientists will drill down into the ice caps and pull up a cylinder of ice. And when you look at this cylinder, it has clearly layering in it that correspond to annual layers of ice. And so Bill Nye is saying, hey, we've got some of these ice cores that reveal hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering. And so how do we respond to that? Well, we respond to it by, and I think we talked about this in an earlier session, understanding that ice core dating is based on uniformitarianism, which every old age dating method that I've ever seen relies on this fundamental assumption, and that is uniformitarianism. It's the idea that whatever you see going on today geologically has always gone on in that same way throughout time. There never were things in the past that happen that don't happen today that would have caused irregular rates of erosion or accumulation or whatever it might be. So today, if you see layering forming one layer per year, you assume it's always been that way throughout time. But if it is the case that you can actually have more than one layer forming each year, it would totally destroy this assumption that the ice cores can be used in dating the Earth as being hundreds of thousands of years old. And sure enough, you actually go out and look at the physical evidence, you see that that evidence exists. When we have individual storms and cyclical weather patterns, that can cause layers that resemble annual layers, even though they're actually subannual. And so you'll recall from an earlier session, an important aspect of the creation flood model is that after the flood, there was an ice age. The flood would have caused an ice age to happen, and so we would argue that during that ice age, there would have been, for a few hundred years, the very kind of weather that would have caused as many as 1,000 annual cycles of ice even in 1 year. Now, modern estimates for ice accumulation in Greenland, they say, are less than 1 foot of accumulation each year, but has that estimate been the same throughout time? That's the question. No, even in modern times, we have examples of the rapid deposition of ice in Greenland rather than this uniformitarian type of deposition, the depositing of ice. For example, in 1988, ground-penetrating radar was used to discover the location of some abandoned World War II planes from back in 1942 in Greenland. And surprisingly, these planes had been buried under more than 260 feet of ice and snow in that amount of time. So that is over 5 feet of ice accumulating every year for 46 years. So not the average of 1 foot per year. So even in modern times, uniformitarian estimates for these ice layers don't coincide with the actual observable evidence when you get in the field. So Bill Nye's use of ice cores to try to prove an old Earth simply doesn't hold ice under scrutiny. All right, Bill Nye argued you've got bristlecone pine trees that are alive today that are as much as 6,800 years old, and even a Norway spruce tree called Old Chico that is 9,550 years old at the time of that debate. So if so, then these trees would have had to have survived the flood, possibly even precede creation week, so this would seem to be a major problem for creationists. Well, first of all, to understand tree dating, you have to understand something about what is called dendrochronology. So dendrochronologists are scientists that study tree rings. And so that you learn a lot more from tree rings than just the age of a tree. You can learn about climate in the past and whether there was drought conditions and so forth. But the way that trees are growing today, you see one of these rings forming each year as the tree is growing. Now, he mentioned old bristlecone pine trees that are alive, that are 6,000 to 7,000 years old. But you have to ask, which bristlecone pine tree is he talking about? Which is one of the things you'd want to do when you're talking to skeptics and atheists. One of the most important things to do is force them to prove their point. Don't be so vague. What are you talking about? The oldest living bristlecone pine tree was discovered in 2012 and dated as being 5,062 years old using tree ring counting and cross dating. So that means it started growing around 3,000 to 3,100 BC. So is that a problem for the creation model? Well, potentially, if you have a tree older than when the flood was supposed to have occurred, the biblical model places the flood as recent as 2300 BC based on the chronologies of Genesis 5 and 11 coupled with history back to Abraham. And so we're talking about 4,300 years ago, but there's room to expand that number by several years in the chronologies of Genesis 11, and we have an article on our website that talks about that. So that already eliminates the supposed problem that Bill Nye is asserting. But also consider that once again, they're assuming uniformity in tree ring growth. So one ring forming each year. We know today that rings don't always correlate with single years. Sometimes rings can form subannually. Again, when you have irregular kind of weather patterns, when you have time staggered, repeated disturbances that are caused by unusual weather, that has been shown to severely affect tree ring patterns. And again, with that post-flood ice age ensuing during the formative years of many of our oldest trees, with repeated major storms and atmospheric disturbances, then the circumstances were perfect for the creation of multiple annual tree rings. So it's very possible that the bristlecone pines are actually several years younger than they appear to be. So where did he get 6,800 as opposed to 5,062 as the age of the bristlecones? Well, it's unclear, and again, this is some place where Ken Ham really should have called him on that. Did he misspeak? Is he actually referring not to living bristlecone pines, but dead trees that have been cross-dated? So this is where dendrochronologists will look at tree ring patterns of living and dead trees and even petrified trees sometimes and try to overlap the tree ring patterns to try to get a tree history that goes back much further than living trees. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very imprecise and often even very subjective way of assessing tree ring patterns. We have trees that are alive today growing in the same forest whose tree rings don't match. They don't have the same tree ring pattern, because this is a complicated equation that is affected by the distance a tree is from its water source, the direction sunlight is hitting it, the soil nutrients wherever this tree is, storm patterns. But they argue, hey, you can get a cross-dating sequence back over 8,000 years ago, they say, with the flood being 4 to 5,500 years ago, typically. If true, that would sound like it was a problem for the flood model. But notice it's only potentially a problem if we assume that all trees could not have survived the flood. Now, the text says that all flesh died that moved on the earth. It doesn't talk about plants. So is it possible that there were some areas of the planet that had less turbulence, where some trees could have been able to survive? We know that tree species could have been more robust. They were stronger due to the optimized nature of that pre-flood environment. Bert Craig of the Department of Horticulture and Forestry at Michigan State, he came out and said many tree species can survive months underwater when you have flooding conditions. Horticulturalists Whitlow and Harris produced a monumental work on the effect of flooding on trees, and they documented dozens of species that are able to survive deep flooding for an entire growing season and even for more than 1 year in some cases. So if trees survive the flood, either because they survived being underwater or because they were brought on the ark with Noah, then trees even with over 6,000 rings wouldn't be a problem. Now, that said, even if cross-dating could legitimately take us back thousands of years further than the flood and even further than creation, we have to consider another important aspect of the creation model, and that is that God created the earth with an appearance of age. So, for example, we know that Adam and Eve were not created as zygotes. They were already apparently fully grown humans, able to procreate as God had commanded them to do. Adam is able to carry out biology, doing classification of the animals and tending the garden. They're able to subdue and have dominion over the earth. You would expect starlight from distant stars to already be in place at earth, because Genesis 1:14 tells us that one of the purposes of that starlight is for humans to be able to reckon time with, and so you'd expect that time to be in place. It wouldn't have traveled here, most likely, in any kind of natural way. You'd expect daughter elements and parent elements to be in any kind of radioactive rocks, which would give them an immediate appearance of age, and tree rings would be expected to be in the trees of the earth. Why? Well, because tree rings are necessary as a tree gets bigger in order to support the tree. So the purpose of the tree ring isn't to tell us how old it is. Those tree rings provide strength to the frame of the tree so it doesn't fall down as it gets bigger. So if you've already got fully grown trees, and we'd expect these trees to be fully grown because Adam and Eve needed to eat the fruit from these immediately, then you'd expect them to have tree rings in them. So again, bottom line, tree ages cannot be conclusively known due to the possibility of subannual tree ring growth and the subjective nature of cross-dating and the possibility of mature trees. Now, what about the Norway spruce tree? Now, this was a specific one that he actually brought up, unlike the others. So he mentioned this guy as being 9,550 years old. Now, again, you dig in and look at the actual evidence on what old Chico is. This was dated using carbon dating, not dendrochronology. And so this is not even typically listed among your verified oldest living trees, because carbon-14 is acknowledged to be a very imprecise and suspicious way of dating anything beyond about 3,000 to 3,500 years old, because in large part due to its fundamental foundational assumptions concerning the effect that the Earth's magnetic field has on the production rate of C14, and the assumption that the ratio of C14 to C12 in the atmosphere has remained constant throughout history, which scientists now reject. Archaeologist Brian Fagan of UC Santa Barbara even came out and said carbon dating is not infallible, and general single dates should not be trusted. So if you use carbon dating to date something, then he basically says you shouldn't even trust this. You're going to need to try to use carbon dating multiple times on different things in order to try to make us feel a little more comfortable with a date. So tree ages simply can't be used to disprove creation. All right, let's look at number 3. According to Bill Nye, he said, there are human populations that are far older than that, talking about the flood, with traditions that go back farther than that. Okay, so if that's true, then that would seem to contradict the biblical text, because all civilizations are annihilated at the flood, and only those civilizations that emerged after the flood, and particularly after Babel, should have distinct traditions. So first of all, again, we have to ask what civilizations were being referred to by Bill Nye. We're left to guess and make his argument for him because he doesn't get specific. Is he talking about China? Well, we have records in China that go back to 1600 BC, and beyond that is only uncorroborated legend that exists. So Chinese history can't be said to pose a problem for creation. Is he talking about the Sumerians? 2700 BC is the date of the earliest known Sumerian king. The Sumerian language is said to be the oldest written language, and it's claimed to go back to 3100 BC. But notice that according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the chronology of the first half of the third millennium is largely a matter for the intuition of the individual author. Carbon-14 dates are at present too few and far between to be given undue weight. Consequently, the turn of the fourth to third millennium is to be accepted with due caution and reservations as the date of the invention of writing. So even the date of 3100 BC is speculative, and even if that's right, it still falls after possible flood date estimates, which can be as high as 3500 BC or more. So what about Egypt? Scholars consider 3100 BC to be the commencement of the first Egyptian dynasty, and again, it can't be known conclusively for the same reasons as Sumer, especially due to the inexact nature of tree ring dating, pottery comparison, C14 dating, and historical records, which is what they use to try to get these dates. Some scholars believe that that date can be collapsed a few hundred more years into the 2000s BC, but either way, all of these dates from China, Sumer, and Egypt can fit within the biblical model. So bottom line, Bill Nye's claims don't carry any weight. They don't disprove the biblical account. But I do notice an interesting pattern here. The oldest living tree dates back to about 3100 BC. The Egyptian dynasty goes back to about 3100 BC. The origin of the written language in Sumer goes back to about 3100 BC, with no verifiable civilizations before that time. This is exactly what we would expect if the flood happened. Something significant seems to have occurred immediately prior to that time period, so the post-story of the flood is being verified from multiple independent directions, which is actually a pretty powerful argument for the flood. Number 4, if there was a flood, how do you get the animals to Australia once they left the ark? So Australia is way out there, away from any continent, and any animal that was on Australia before the flood would have been killed. So how do you get animals to Australia from the ark after the flood? Well, first of all, keep in mind that if this is a problem for creationists, guess who it's also a problem for? Evolutionists. How do you get animals out to Australia, period? So evolutionists do not argue, and it would be silly to argue, that animals in Australia evolved completely separately from their own accidental single-celled organism that separately sprang to life hundreds of millions of years ago and evolved into kangaroos. How do you get animals out there, even if you're an evolutionist? Well, whatever you come up with, why wouldn't the same argument be made by creationists? Now, and number 2, now, Bill Nye summarily dismissed the idea of a land bridge connecting Asia to Australia. There actually are islands all along the path from China to Australia, and the water between can be misleading because it hides what's really under there. So notice from this map of the Pacific Sea floor that the continental shelf of China actually extends all the way down to the continental shelf of Australia with only a relatively small gap between the two. So again, when you keep in mind what the creation model would argue, we would say that you're going to have a lot more ice at the poles after the flood as the ice age is going on. And so these continents could have even been touching or been very close to it, and you could have had a lot of this area that was actually land, not water, like it is today. Another option, of course, remember the idea of Pangea, or Rodinia before that, which we talked about in an earlier session, the idea that all the continents were originally crammed together into supercontinents. at least before the flood, and then during the flood that they break apart. And remember that Genesis 1:9 may be alluding to that idea whenever God says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place and let the dry land appear. So if you have all of the water gathered together in one place, what does that say about the land? So the breakup of the fountains of the great deep, Genesis 7:11, is probably talking about the ocean floor, and that is suggesting the commencement of plate tectonics when the flood begins. And as we looked at in session 4, simulations suggest that the movement would have initially been very rapid, the plates moving on the order of meters per second, whereas today the continental separation rate is on the order of centimeters per year, so about as fast as your fingernails grow. And so you have to keep in mind that the plates would have been a lot closer to each other immediately after the flood until they gradually slowed down their movement over time. Now, interestingly, recent research by Yale University geologists provides evidence for the claim that continental movement used to be much faster. In fact, they're thinking at least 3 times faster than it is today. Here's what they said. These observations suggest that either non-uniformitarian plate movement, all right, remember what uniformitarianism is what we're talking about. In other words, maybe the plate movement used to be not uniform like it is today, but maybe it was moving much faster. Either non-uniformitarian plate tectonics or an episode of rapid true polar wander occurred. And I don't even want to talk to you about what this is. This is major catastrophic if this is going on. And this is something creation scientists are actually studying right now. But something is going on during the Cambrian explosion of animal life. So notice 2 things about their study. Number 1, it provides evidence that substantiates the creationist belief that continental movement was at one time much faster. And number 2, it highlights the fact that that accelerated movement occurred during the same time period as the catastrophic event that caused the Cambrian explosion. And remember what the Cambrian explosion is to creationists. That is the beginning of the flood. Now, other recent studies also suggest that the plates moved much faster in the past. So bottom line, if the continents were at one point together, much closer to one another after the flood, then moving animals from one continent to another wouldn't be insurmountable. But there are other options for the creation model as well. It's possible that the post-flood ice age would have allowed migration across frozen channels. And that is definitely the case, like, for example, across the English Channel. That is understood to be one of those type ice bridges, and possibly the Bering Strait as well, connecting Asia with North America. Now, another plausible option, there would have been, no doubt, dead pre-flood forests that were ripped up from before the flood and are now floating on the waters of the flood as the flood waters are receding. And so there would have been small land masses for travel across channels on these floating forests. Now, before you think that is, an absurd idea, this is a picture from 2012 of Spirit Lake near Mount St. Helens. This is 32 years after the big 1980 eruption. And so notice this floating log mat from that catastrophic event. This image is from the Telegraph, a popular newspaper out of the UK. And notice the title of the article that contained this picture: Massive Floating Rubbish Islands from Japan Tsunami Spotted on the Pacific, they say. And so here's a shot of this island floating across the Pacific toward the U.S. West Coast. This particular debris island was 69 miles in length. It covered an expanse of over 2.2 million square feet. Notice this picture. In the description, it explains that members of the Japan Coast Guard found and rescued this dog from one of those debris islands from that tsunami 3 weeks after the tsunami. All right, so 3 weeks after this, they actually rescued an animal on one of these debris islands floating out in the ocean. So it's not outlandish to suppose that massive debris islands would have been found worldwide after the flood, even more substantial than this kind of debris island that was from that tsunami in Japan. And as added evidence of the legitimacy of this theory, Recent genetic analysis suggests that the marsupials in Australia, including the kangaroo, originated in South America before they moved to Australia. And so whenever we look at the projection of what the ocean currents would have looked like in the Paleocene and the Oligocene periods, which is immediately after the flood, then you see there would have likely been an ocean current moving straight from South America over to Australia. And interestingly, ocean currents are argued to be how various creatures got from South America to the famous Galapagos Islands that Darwin studied. So it was actually an argument that he himself used. All right, if a tsunami in one small area of the world could make such a floating island of debris, then why wouldn't a global flood create similar and even more substantial islands of debris? And of course, one final possibility as to how you get animals to Australia. Humans could have brought them. And granted, that's not an option for the evolutionists because they don't believe humans are on the scene yet when animals show up in Australia. But this is not a problem for the flood model. All right, number 5. According to Bill Nye, we've got 16 million species on the planet today. And if you've only got 7,000 species on the planet or on the ark 4,000 years ago, that would require 11 completely new species emerging every day since the flood. And I got to tell you, whenever I first heard that argument, I thought, oh man, that's a powerful argument. How do you deal with that? That seems pretty unrealistic. Well, again, whenever an atheist brings something up like that, you got to squeeze them. Where are you getting your facts? I'll tell you one thing he's right about, and he's right in his representation of one thing about the flood. We don't claim that all current animal varieties and even species were on the ark. Not every variety of dog and even species of the dog kind were on the ark. So species is a modern concept that's defined by humans. We argue what the biblical text says, the different kinds of animals were on the ark, Genesis 6:20. So for example, perhaps a representative of the dog kind, from which came your domestic dog breeds that we have today, as well as your wolves, foxes, coyotes, jackals, and dingoes. There was probably a cat kind, a horse kind, an elephant kind, and so forth on the ark. So something more like the modern taxonomic category of family or genus. So you're able to see, for example, in the dog family, a lot of interbreeding that can go on between these different kinds of species. And so that suggests they're all part of the same biblical kind that would have emerged after the flood. So there's no need to fit every single modern species on the ark, which would be difficult if not impossible. And there's no need to, because many different species within a kind could have come about through whatever diversification process is going on. So there would have been representatives from each kind that had the genetic material to produce the diversity of creatures that we see within those kinds today. So it's true, from those original proto-species on the ark, all current land and creeping thing species would have to have emerged through some kind of diversification process. So Bill Nye said 7,000 proto-species on the ark. He was quoting Ken Ham, apparently. We don't know if it was 7,000 original species, but creation scientists are looking into that subject. It could have been more, it could have been less. So here's what Bill Nye said. He said, you'd go out into your yard, you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird. You'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species of bird every day. This would be enormous news. I mean, the last 4,000 years, people would have seen these changes among us. We see no evidence of that. There's no evidence of these species, he says. All right, so in response, again, first of all, we need to know again, where did he get his 16 million count for the number of species on the planet? That is perhaps the first rule, again, when you're dealing with a skeptic, require that they prove their information. There's a lot of disagreement among biologists about how many species there are today, but that estimate is extremely high. Some estimates are as low as 2 million species on the planet, including an estimate that was published in Science magazine in 2013. One study from 2011 that seems to be well researched and accepted by many, so much so that it was published by the Public Library of Science Biology Division. They estimated not 16 million, but 10,960,000, and that estimate included not only the kingdom Animalia, but plantae, fungi, protozoa, chromista, archaea, and even your bacteria. So keep in mind that these are estimates. The actual catalog number of species on the planet 2011 was 1,438,769. So they're projecting that eventually we're going to find 11 million species. All right, now Bill Nye needs to be sure to accurately reflect what the Bible claims. So from that 11 million estimate, we need to subtract marine creatures. They wouldn't have been on the ark. So you remove ocean-dwelling creatures, that brings you down to 8.7 million, and possibly other creatures that could survive in water could be removed, various amphibians, for example, but we'll leave them in there for the sake of argument. Plants, the text doesn't mention plants being taken onto the ark since they aren't flesh, other than those that the passengers would be eating. So that brings us down to 8.4 million. Now, incidentally, would the plants have died in the flood if they weren't taken on the ark? And no doubt many certainly would have, though, as I said earlier, not necessarily all of them. Interestingly, most of the planet's plants are, in fact, under the water today. But also seeds could have been brought onto the ark, and perhaps more likely, you got to think about the seeds that would have been available and all of those dead plants that are floating on the waters of the flood, that once they then hit the land, the seeds could have regerminated and begun to grow. And studies show that seeds can survive being submersed in salt water for extended periods of time. And ironically, guess who conducted such a study for evolutionary purposes? Charles Darwin himself did that. Next, you have what are called synonymous species. This is where you have two names that are accidentally given to the same species. So creatures that originally maybe were thought to be two distinct species, and now they're accepted as being actually one and the same. Or one creature whose name has changed over time, and yet both names were unintentionally counted. Now, the PLOSB paper highlighted this weakness in species estimates, explaining that a survey of 2,938 taxonomists with expertise across all major domains of life revealed that synonyms are a major problem at the species level. They believe that 17.9% of all named species could be synonyms, and possibly much more, as much as 46.6%. The World Register of Marine Species documents that 44.5% of all accepted marine species are actually synonyms. So if, just for the sake of argument, we take the lowest estimate of synonymous species, that only 17.9% of those species are synonyms, that now brings us down under 7 million species. So notice a far cry from the 16 million estimate. Now, if the flood was 4,500 years ago instead of 4,000, which is closer to our estimate, that brings you down to 4 new species still showing up every day, not 11. Now, if there are fewer species, then the projections, which is likely, if there are more synonyms, which is almost certain, if there are more years since the flood, which is probable, if you've got more species that could survive outside of the ark, which is likely, and if there are more representatives on the ark, then that number continues to plummet, and we're still not done. Insects, other invertebrates, fungi, bacteria, protozoa, these are all included in that 11 million species, even though many of those would not have been on the ark. Invertebrates, for example, make up 95 to 99% of the planet's animal species. Insects alone make up about half of that remaining 6.9 million species, and many of these could have survived outside of the ark, significantly reducing the remaining list. Though admittedly some creeping things were in fact taken onto the ark, according to Genesis 6:20, but that is generally understood to be things like reptiles and amphibians, but possibly also some of the what we'd consider to be insects. Now, of those that are left, we keep in mind the fast reproductive rates of those smaller creatures like insects that might have been on the ark. They can cause rapid speciation immediately after the flood. So the rapid diversification of the creatures within the original ark kinds. Flies can lay as many as 100 eggs a day. According to the American Society of Microbiology, one bacterium can produce 10 billion in 10 hours. So many new species could have been emerging rapidly in the centuries immediately following the flood, and the rate could have then since slowed down to a certain extent due to niche conservatism. So bottom line, 11 new species a day is nowhere near an accurate, fair assessment of the data. Even 4 would be quite an overestimate, and most of those would be tiny creatures, completely unnoticed by humans, even though Bill Nye claimed that such rapid speciation would have been noticed by humans. That was his main argument. So when you consider that the Earth has a volume of over 1 trillion cubic kilometers, humans only inhabit a tiny space on the Earth comparatively, and therefore we're just not in a position to know what all is going on in and on the Earth. So the odds that a species would happen to emerge in your backyard, much less that it would be even large enough for you to see it, is essentially zero. But notice that in spite of that, here's the ironic thing that Bill Nye did not bring up. According to the literature, scientists are still discovering 15,000 new species every year. We're stumbling across, we're noticing that many species that have never been known about before every year. So guess how many newly discovered species that averages out to every day? 41, not 11. All right, according to Bill Nye, he said the National Zoo, it takes 163 acres to exhibit 400 species. How could the Ark hold 14,000 creatures, he said. And so again, it's uncertain as to whether or not this would be 14,000 is even a good estimate of the representative proto-species on the Ark, but for the sake of argument, let's go with it. First of all, the Ark and the zoo aren't a very good parallel, are they? The Ark was not about displaying creatures. This is about basic shelter. So a better parallel would be like a factory farm or high-density housing facilities which can house tens of thousands of animals in tight quarters under one roof. But also, number 2, if the cubit is 18 inches long, as most scholars estimate, so the length from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, the Ark would have been 450 feet long, so a football field and a half long, by 75 feet wide by 45 feet high. Creation geologist and biologist John Woodmarappy did an extensive study on how much space would be required to house 16,000 animals, so not even just the 14,000, but 16,000. This is representatives of each of the genus, and he took into account food, water, waste disposal, heating, ventilation, and lighting, and found that the Ark was more than adequate in size to house the animals on that sized Ark. But also consider, what if humans were generally larger in the pre-flood era due to better health and life longevity, as we talked about in a previous session. So we, of course, know that enormous reptiles lived on the planet in the pre-flood world. We know about enormous fruit that had to be carried by 2 men on poles a few centuries after the flood. Enormous humans mentioned in Genesis 6 and elsewhere. We looked at Homo heidelbergensis, which is a representative of much larger humans that were around immediately after the flood. So what if the cubit was bigger than 18 inches, as some estimates actually make it? So for example, a 25-inch instead of an 18-inch cubit more than doubles the volume of space on the Ark, from 1.5 million cubic feet to 4 million cubic feet. And of course, we can also reason that the animals would likely not have been full-sized animals. Why? So they may have been babies or adolescents. Why would we say that? Well, smaller animals are going to take up less space. They're going to eat less food, assuming that some of them are not in a hibernative state. They're going to make less waste. Also, though, younger animals would make it where those animals would survive longer after the flood to be able to repopulate the planet for longer. So you'd expect that God would want juveniles on the Ark so they'd live long enough to repopulate the planet afterwards. So bottom line, there was enough space for many, many animals. Bill Nye's criticism doesn't disprove the biblical account. In fact, I'd argue that it gives it another chance to shine. It shows that the biblical model is robust. But what about the dinosaurs? Would dinosaurs have been on the Ark? Well, creation scientists know with a high level of confidence where the flood begins in the geologic strata and in the fossil record. We think that it's the Cambrian strata as beginning the flood, so your Cambrian explosion. The Precambrian is then before the flood, and the line that separates them is called the Great Unconformity. So it is a massive erosional surface that goes across the entire planet that scraped off basically the top of the earth and then started dumping sediment and piling it on top of it. What in the world would that have been? Well, so anyway, the dinosaur fossils that have been found are all in those flood strata that are above the Cambrian, the Great Unconformity. All the dinosaur fossils, including their footprints, are found above that. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the dinosaurs are alive when the flood begins, which means that as land-living creatures, they would have been represented on the ark. Well, the average size of a dinosaur is about the size of an American bison. And so this isn't even, we tend to think about your massive sauropod dinosaurs, but in actuality, the average size is about the size of an American bison. And again, we would suspect juvenile forms to have been on the ark, and even the sauropod dinosaurs, your long neck, long tailed guys that are as tall as this building, in fact, start in an egg about this big. We actually have a replica at AP. The titanosaur egg is about this big. They start out tiny, and so getting dinosaurs on the ark is not a problem. All right, number 7, our last one I wanted to go through. Wish we had time. I could go through a bunch of other ones, but Bill Nye gave the example of the large wooden ship, the Wyoming, which was built in 1909. It sank in 1924 due to the tendency of its long wooden planks to twist and buckle on the heavy seas. So if wooden planks tend to twist and buckle when they're that big, then wouldn't even an even larger wooden vessel like the ark be unseaworthy? Well, number one, as with the ark and a zoo, the Wyoming and the ark aren't a good parallel. And I don't even understand why Bill Nye is actually a mechanical engineer. I don't understand why he'd make this argument. It's a silly argument. The Wyoming had 6 masts and several sails that would have created immense torsion from the wind filling those sails on the open seas, which would definitely cause a lot of twisting and buckling. But the ark, of course, wouldn't have had sails because it didn't need to go anywhere. It just needed to be able to float. And so the torsion problem would have been not really an issue with the ark. Number 2, large ancient wooden ships have been found that trace back to immediately after the flood in Egypt that are equipped with a sophisticated engineering mechanism that's an interlocking plank system called mortise and tenon joints. And these are known to help prevent twisting and provide added strength to the frame of these sea vessels. So seaworthy, large wooden ships were not out of the question for people at that time. Number 3, nobody knows what gopher wood was. And God was very specific in choosing that as the wood for the ark. Now, Moses mentions several other specific species of wood in the Pentateuch, including terebinth, green poplar, almond, palm, willow, olive, fig, pomegranate, chestnut, and many others are listed outside of the Pentateuch in Scripture. And God chose this mysterious wood called gopher. And there may be no modern equivalent to it when you consider that many of those pre-flood tree species could have gone extinct. And even of those that didn't, they likely would have, they've been subjected to the same genetic entropy we have in our bodies over the years. The human body is not what it would have been whenever God originally created it, and the same goes for anything else on the planet. Everything's gone through a lot of genetic entropy. So it's highly unlikely that we even have an equivalent wood today. So gopher wood was clearly chosen because it was conducive to God's instructions for the ark, whatever it was. And number 4, notice that the Wyoming, in spite of its problems, stayed afloat for 15 years. But the ark only needed to stay afloat for even less than a year. So bottom line, Bill Nye didn't show the ark to be unseaworthy. Again, it gives the creation model an opportunity to prove that it is a robust model scientifically. And interestingly, the dimensions of the ark have been shown to produce a seaworthy vessel. The SS Great Britain, which was in service back in the 1800s, had a dimension ratio of 322 length to 51 width to 32 height, almost exactly that of the ark. In World War II, a group of ships were constructed nicknamed the Ugly Ducklings, and similar to the Ark, these were cargo ships. They were built not for speed or combat, but just to transport a lot of stuff through harsh seas. And the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, one of those vessels, is 442 feet by 57 feet by 28 feet. And when you convert from cubits to feet, then again you see this lines up remarkably close to the design of the Ark as well. Also, the most recently designed super jumbo barges, which, like the O'Brien, are a better parallel to the Ark because their purpose is just to stay afloat while they transport immense amounts of cargo. These modern barges have a length to width dimension ratio very similar to that of the Ark as well. And then we have oil tankers, the very large crude oil carriers, your VLCC, you call it super tankers. Their length to width to height in meters, again, very close to the Ark's dimension ratio. So notice a trend here. If you want to build a boat that is intended to haul enormous amounts of material, the best design is to use a length to width to height ratio like God picked in what he told Noah to build. So clearly, someone knew what he was doing when he designed the Ark. He was no amateur. So again, Bill and I brought up several other points that I address in this Reason and Revelation response to that debate. So be sure to grab a copy of that if you are interested in studying a little bit more on this subject. And again, my book, Flooded, goes into a lot of this stuff as well, but on a more teen level. All right, I almost forgot to tell you about this. Apologetic Express, we just a few days ago, a foundation out in Texas offered to do a matching campaign for us where if we can, as much as we can raise financially between now and December 22nd, they'll match it up to $150,000. So whatever we can raise, they'll match that amount of money in donation to AP. So I want to make sure you're aware of that. I know this congregation and individuals here have helped us in the past, and I want to make sure you're aware of that in case you're interested in helping us with even this kind of work that I'm involved in studying this kind of thing. All right. Again, I wish I had more time to dig into this even deeper. Our last session, I believe, is next Wednesday, and we'll wrap this up by answering the question, why would somebody even want to become a Christian? What are the benefits of Christianity that would make it where you could sell that lifestyle to somebody that really looks unkindly on the idea of being a Christian? Appreciate your attention. I'll turn it over to you guys for the closing prayer.
Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, we are grateful for this day that we've had, a day, Father, that we could live for you and to glorify you in all that we do. Father, we're grateful for your word. We're grateful for the power that it has. We're grateful that it's authoritative, that it can be trusted. We're thankful for people like Dr. Miller and those at AP have taken the time to study your word and to study outside your word, to give us confidence that what your word says is true. And Father, we're grateful for your word, that it has the power to transform lives. That, Father, those who read and study it can come to know you, that they can become a new creation, that they could be one of your people, that they could be one of your children, that they can spend eternity with you in heaven. We pray, Father, that we share that message with those around us, that this world will not perish without the message of Jesus going out. We pray all this through our Savior, and amen.